Neil Boothby bize erken yaş zorlukları Suriyeli çocuklara yönelik uygulamalar başlık altında bir sunum hazırladı. Kendisi Kolombiya Üniversitesi'nin zorunlu göç ve sağlık programının başkanıdır. Yokluk ve tehlikenin çocuklar üzerindeki etkisi konusuna yoğunlaşan Boothby, Amerika Birleşik Devletleri hükümetinin çocuklar ve güçlük bölümünün özel danışmanlığını yaptı. Başkanlığı altında Beyaz Saray, güçlük içinde çocuklar için ABD hükümeti aksiyon planını uygulamaya geçirdi. Ki bu zorluk çeken çocuklara yönelik ilk yabancı destek girişimiydi. Boothby, savaştan etkilenen çocuklar ve mülteci çocuklar ile ilgili birçok makale yayınladı. Kendisi Kızıl Haç Yılın İnsanisi Ödülü ve Birleşmiş Milletler'in Sosyal Bilimler Üstün Küresel Başarı Ödülü gibi birçok saygın ödülün sahibidir. Bu oturumumuz 1 saat olacak. Bir 15 dakika soru cevap kısmı olacak sonunda. Şimdi kendisini davet ediyorum.
What I want to do is just show a very short video on how brains form. Whoops. At least I hope I do. Where'd you go?
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
Okay, so one of the things that make human beings, that make us unique as a species, is our intellectual capacity. It's our brains. And it strikes me at times we don't talk enough about brain health, and we'll do a bit of that today. And what this video is showing really is that the basic architecture of the brain is constructed through a process that begins early in life and continues into adulthood. And that genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences influence how and whether genes are expressed. And together, the genes and the experience shape the quality of the brain architecture. Plasticity, or the ability for the brain to reorganize and adapt, is greatest in the first years of life and decreases with age. I think that's one of the basic premises that we're working on, and one of the things that makes children children as opposed to just small adults. Emotional well-being and social competence provide a strong foundation for the emerging cognitive abilities, and together they are the bricks and mortar that comprise the foundation of human development. Brain architecture establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all of the learning, health, and behavior that follow. And if we look at one of the take-homes of the short video that we saw, we see that in a certain sense, normal brain plasticity, or the ability to adapt to what experience is bringing us, is greatest in embryo and in the first months of life. And as we get older, it decreases. So those of us that are older and we look down at this chart, we see that it's harder for us to learn things. Because in the process of brain development, once we start hearing a certain language, for example, our brain focuses in on that, and in doing so, other circuitry begins to drop off. And so the circuitry required to get good at specific things that we're experiencing strengthens, while plasticity, or the possibility of doing other things, begins to be pruned away. Speak closer to the microphone, okay. And, whoops, let me come back to this one here. If we look at then the blue line shows the physiological or the biological effort required to do things as we get older in some ways. So it's not that someone 50 or 60 years old can't learn a language, it's just harder for us. Now, what we also saw in the video was the kinds of key human developments that take place really quite early in life. And if we look at that first year, again, the last 3 years of embryonic development on through, a year or so into life, we see these key capacities that we have as human beings to hear things, to smell things, to speak, and even the foundation for higher cognitive development are all formed during this critical time in life. Now, to me, maybe the only scientific miracle I've seen in my career is the importance that human beings play in the lives of one another, and in particular children. And if there was ever a species that was wired for relationships, it's us. And one way to understand the relationship between biological development and social interaction, or brain capacity, 85% of our brain capacity is developed in these early months and years, is to understand the role that adults play in the lives of children, especially in these early years. And think of tennis, if you play tennis. If you hit the ball, if you serve the ball, someone on the other side has to be there to respond to that. And those of you that have been mothers and fathers, think of the power that a baby's cry has in your life. She's cold, she cries, and you pick her up. She's hungry, she cries, and you feed her. Think of, the serve and the response. This human interaction is what the experience actually gets into our genes and strengthens intellectual capacity, cognitive development, and becomes part of our epigenetic signature. And if we look at this then from a biological perspective, it actually, and I'm going to read this so our translator has a chance to translate. So the physiological activity created by experience is powerful in shaping brain architecture and actually changes the chemistry that encodes the genes in brain cells. External experiences spark signals between neurons, and the cells respond by producing proteins. These gene regulatory proteins head to the cell nucleus, so experience comes into our bodies, becomes part of our DNA. So the gene regulatory proteins head to the cell nucleus, where they are attracted or repelled by enzymes that can attach them to genes. Positive experiences, such as exposure to rich learning opportunities, and negative influences, such as malnutrition or environmental toxins, leave a chemical signature on the genes, which can be temporary or permanent. This process is called epigenetic modification. Now, we could go on and explain this a bit more genetically or biologically, but the main point is this: is it nature or nurture that determines who we are? And what science tells us, it's both. And it happens early in life. So when you pick your child up and you sing to her, or you put her to bed at night and you tell her stories, and you hold her, and you meet her needs, you are becoming part of her DNA. And to me, it's actually quite miraculous, and it's scientifically provable. Now, the other thing I want to stress is James Heckman and other economists really have looked at where key investments have the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. And it's not surprising, given how brain capacity forms early, that investments early are actually very, very important. And it starts to decline over time. Now, those of us that work in academia, we don't like to show this graph because it would suggest that we ought to be spending more money earlier on in education, but we still get more than our fair share. So if that's a quick introduction to what goes right, we're going to switch now into adversity and look at the effects of various deprivations and dangers on children.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So once again, human beings are often the difference, the availability or the absence of human beings in responsive social care between how children experience events and what the consequences are. So it's important to realize that it's not the event per se often that determines outcome, but it's the event as filtered by and mediated by adults around the child. A couple of quick examples. I was in Afghanistan, this is back pre-invasion, and a bomb went off in a part of Kabul where I was staying, and there were two houses that were in proximity to each other. Each had young babies. And in the one house, the bomb went off, or when the bomb went off, the windows were shattered and shook, and it was quite frightening. And the baby started crying, but her mother was there, and immediately went and picked it up and said, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay, it's calm." And really, within a matter of minutes, the baby was back asleep. Whereas in the other house, the family had been outside. The baby woke up to the threatening experience, and she cried, and she cried, and she cried, and she cried, and there was no one there to mediate that experience. I mean, that's a simple example of what we mean by an event, but being mediated by adults around the child. So toxic stress, which is long activation of stress responses that has biological consequences and actually can get into our brains and begin to weaken architecture, especially when you're young. The way to protect that is through the social care and nurturing relationships as best we can. Now, the other thing I think that's quite important, there's been a lot of research done around risk and resilience, epidemiological work as well as qualitative work. And what we know is it's not necessarily one bad thing happening in the life of a child that determines or leads to a negative outcome, but it's the accumulation of risk. So children normally can deal with one adversity. So let's just say, pick a simple one, like you get divorced and your father moves away. Most children who come from divorced families, if that's the only bad thing that happens to them, they grow up fine. But if you get divorced, your family income comes down, a second adversity, and you have to move out of your neighborhood and out of your peer group and out of your schools. A third adversity. When 3 bad things happen simultaneously to children, the likelihood, statistically, of negative outcomes as an adult, including non-communicable disease, cardiovascular problems, mental health, etc., goes up 4-fold. So 1 risk, no statistical equation. 2 risks, it slides up a little. 3 risks, there's a 4-fold increase in the likelihood of negative health and mental health outcomes. Now, this is another study that was done in Jamaica that I think is very, very important. The upper black line is a group of non-stunted children. The red line represents when stunted children got both nutritional inputs and positive social care. And you'll notice over time, they get up close to where the non-stunted group was. The next line, which I believe is blue, those children were stunted but only got the social care, the stimulation. The line under that, which I think is yellow, got only micronutrient or nutrition interventions. And then the line below are a stunted group that got nothing. Now, what is fascinating to me is you have to conclude that both things put together is the best programmatic intervention. But if you had to choose between social care and nutrition, at least in this case, that there was bigger bang for the buck with the social care. And I think that's something as health professionals, we don't often understand the role and importance of maternal mothering, social care, and whatnot in the health of children, both cognitively, but in this case, with stunting. And of course, stunting is not just small bodies, but it's also small brains. And again, if we looked then at a study that was done in the country in Colombia, we found similar kind of research that took place that's sustained over time. So by the time that children that got both nutritional support and social care were in school, at least in terms of height and weight, those gains were sustained and were better when you got both interventions as opposed to one or the other. This is an important study as well if we want to understand the importance of social care and child health and development. It was done in Bucharest, and if you recall in Romania, there was a period of time in which there was a social experiment, a political experiment going on, and during this time, lots of children were put in orphanages because the family was perceived at times to be a negative influence to the political goals that were being sought at that particular time. And I think many of us, if we're old enough, recall the kind of with horror the images that came out of Romania when we discovered, quote unquote, all the babies in these institutions and whatnot. There were a group of researchers that went in and did, I think, some very, very important studies where they looked at the children's health and development of children in orphanages, and then the control group or the comparison group were children in Bucharest that lived in families. And what we have here is an image of brain capacity. And when you look on the right, orange and yellow is good because it shows that there's lots of brain activity going on. There's lots of intellectual capacity. That represents the brain scan of what the average IQ was of children in families, which was 104. Now, the one on the left was taken of young children in orphanages at around the age of 2, if I recall correctly. And if you look at the orange and the yellow, there just isn't much capacity. There isn't much going on. And that represents what a scan of a brain looks like with an IQ of 64, because that was the average IQ of children in these orphanages. Now, these were orphanages that had actually been improved. They weren't the horrific ones that we had seen. Now, the good news is if you moved a child out of an orphanage under the age of 2 and put her in a family, within a reasonable period of time, her IQ went up into the mid-90s. So it got much better, showing, again, plasticity of the brain and the capacity to adapt. Semicolon, it didn't get back to 104, also showing the criticalness of certain times in children's development. If you waited till after the age of 2 and removed the child from the orphanage and put her in a family, the IQ went up, that's the good news, but it never got really beyond sort of the high 70s. Now, the difference at the level of an individual between an IQ of 104 and an IQ of 75 is very significant in terms of how your life is going to be. But if you think about national economies and labor force and whatnot, it's very challenging for countries that have children who have diminished capacity because of the absence of social care in this case. The last slide I'd like to show, and I think it fits into the discussion that was taking place earlier today, comes through what's called the ACEs study, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, which has accumulated a lot of important information on the long-term lasting effects of danger and deprivation, maltreatment and violence on children, and shows pretty clearly back to the multiple risks, 3 bad things happening leads to bad outcomes, of the kinds of problems that are faced by children who grow up in adversity, who grow up with chronic toxic stress. And you see that they die earlier, they have more cardiovascular disease, they have more cancer, they are more prone to drink, they're more prone to end up in jail and whatnot. So what we do in childhood is critical to the kinds of problems you'll face later on in your healthcare system. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this because this largely, if you're interested, I can send you the presentation, but it's largely kind of what works from a WHO standpoint. There's examples where kind of the brain science is beginning to impact agendas in Europe, United States, Uganda, and Rwanda as examples where they're actually starting to program now around some of this new science. And then if we turn to Syria and whatnot, again, we talked about this, so I won't spend a lot of time, but clearly the experiences in Syria have a huge impact on what is going on in the lives of children today, Syrian children in Turkey. And the numbers have been counted here, but I think that if we look specifically at some of the challenges then with children, places that they went to school don't exist any longer. Their teachers have been killed in large numbers. And I think, if I'm correct, only 1 out of 4 Syrian children anywhere in the world today are actually in school. And so that's tragic from the standpoint of individual human development. But imagine when these kids grow up and become youth. So they've gone through brutal experiences, they're not being educated, and they're not going to be as employable as they were they in school. And it represents not only a human tragedy, but it represents potentially a significant problem in the region in terms of what are these young people going to do. We've looked at the numbers again and where they are. We won't spend time there. I just want to point out a few things, again, from the perspective of a child. If you're in a refugee camp, I guess the good news is, you're getting some goods and services and whatnot. The way that those goods and services are presented or delivered creates a kind of dependency. It doesn't create a lot of economic opportunity, and it keeps you sort of in limbo that way. The other things from a child's standpoint is the female caretakers, your mothers, have to stand in line a long, long time to get some of this stuff. And the question of what is the interaction with the child, how much energy is there to focus on that important task in life is questionable. If we move to some of the non-camp situations, again, I think some of what we've learned in this area is a lot of people don't want to be registered because they may want to go someplace else. There's perceived to be more opportunity to work, even if somewhat clandestinely and whatnot. But there's challenges with that. I mean, culturally, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not. In some parts of Syria, women don't necessarily work out of the house. That's considered to be a man's responsibility. There's a significant percentage of families in Jordan and Lebanon, I know, that are mother-headed households or female-headed households. And so increasingly children, boys and girls, or boys in particular, are required, or by necessity, to work outside of the home. And in some cases, if men are available, they're not as employable as youth in terms of that. We've seen increases in early marriages, arranged marriages. I think 32% of all Syrian refugee marriages registered in Jordan, for example, in the first quarter of 2014, involved a girl under the age of 18, according to UNICEF. So again, the economic struggle creates different ramifications for families. They have to adapt to that, and early marriage might be one of the ways that they're doing that. Now, just one other piece of information and then questions for you all. The Turkish Red Cross did an assessment recently in Turkey, and the purpose of the assessment was they had a community-based resource center, health center, and they were trying to figure out how it could be effective in this context. So it's similar to the discussion we had earlier about the health centers, the migrant centers. And I'll focus on three things that the respondents thought were important. We've surveyed ourselves, and this comes a little bit from what Syrian refugees in urban areas thought were important. The number one thing that they put forward, and one of the top things they put forward, is shelter, and that the majority are living in crowded single-room households, and that in many cases they're not apartments necessarily, but they're storerooms or barns, according to this survey. The rents are expensive, and that there's concerns about toxins in these places. So not only do some of them not have toilets, for example, but there's lead paint and there's other problems that we know is detrimental to children, and there's poor water sanitation. So from a public health challenge and from a health systems challenge, how do you respond to the threats at the household level? And remember that with children, 70% of the day-to-day care, health, protection happens in the household. It is the center of the universe, so to speak, for children, and needs to be thought of as a very important part of a health system. The Red Crescent survey also found that employment and economic survival was critical. Unemployment is the norm, discrimination, harsh conditions when they get labor. Sometimes it's labor that others don't want to do. Sometimes it's dangerous. Children are being employed, sometimes in difficult, dangerous situations. And again, the public health challenge, if we're concerned about toxic stress, if we're concerned about prevention, how do you combine protection and health? They're not separate sectors. They actually come together in the lives of children and others. How do you work in that element? And then the last area, which has been touched on in the last session, is the idea of the experiences that they've gone through and what is sometimes referred to as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder versus syndrome when it lasts over a certain period of time. And certainly we've heard that people still suffer from loss of loved ones, from nightmares, from bad memories, and whatnot. I think that the question here for kids is they could be going through this themselves, but if their mothers in particular, if their fathers are absent and their mothers are consumed with grief and despair, how responsive are they? Think of the tennis match. If the baby cries, is there the energy to pick her up and move on from there? And again, I think the public health challenge here is if the majority of the population, and I think we heard a figure that was over 50%, at least that might be an estimate, if a majority of the population is suffering from what we sometimes refer to psychiatrically as PTSD, how do you respond to a health challenge, a mental health challenge that is so widespread? Do we have enough psychiatrists? Do we just go to the medication route, or are there things that can happen at the household and community level that are preventative and proactive and whatnot? And there have been some lessons learned in different parts of the world that may or may not be applicable here. 2 more slides. WHO defines a health system as follows. Consists of all organizations, people, and actions whose primary intent is to promote, restore, or maintain health. It goes beyond, it addresses efforts to influence determinants of health as well as more direct health improving activities. It's more than a pyramid of publicly owned facilities. It includes, for example, a mother who's caring for her child. It includes vector control campaigns, health insurance programs, health and safety legislation, and you can read on from there. If we take that definition and try to apply it to the situation here, this represents the district hospital, first layer, and community levels, this comes out of the sphere's standards. This is what one would learn if you were working in what our friend Fawad has suggested isn't as applicable here in Turkey. This comes more out of a low-income country sort of scenario. And if you look at the community level, for example, you often have to ensure these things, are taking place. As I've listened to the conversation here, the challenge that I hear is at the community and household level. And I just may be hearing it from the perspective of children, or I'll put it perhaps that way, from the perspective of the child, the household, and then the community level is going to be very significant. And so my question to you is, if you were designing, or as you're designing these community migrant centers, as you're looking at ways to mobilize civil society around the health concerns of Syrian refugees, what is it that needs to happen at the household level? What outcomes do you want to see? And then how would you go about mobilizing that at scale? I think that is the public health challenge. Yes, ma'am.
So you are asking me suggestions for us?
Well, okay, so yes.
I do have some.
Good.
Yeah. Should I switch in Turkish?
You can speak whatever you want, and I'll get my headphones.
Sizin de belirttiğiniz gibi aslında yeterli beslenme ve eğitim ve bunun yanında da sosyal koruma programları aslında kendi kendine yetebilme ve geçim kaynağı, İngilizcesi livelihood dediğimiz mefhumlara aslında bize götüren olmazsa olmaz konular. İşte yeterli beslenme, eğitim ve sosyal koruma. Ama bunun haricinde bu toplantılarda da sürekli konuşuyoruz. Aslında programların birbiriyle konuşması, sektörlerin birbiriyle konuşması lazım. Yani altyapıya yatırım yapılması lazım, kredi fasilitelerine ulaşabilmeleri lazım mültecilerin. Sosyal servislerin yeterli ve herkes için erişilebilir olması lazım. Çalışma izinlerinden bahsedildi. Sadece çalışma izinleri değil ama iş imkanlarının olması lazım. İletişim ağlarının oluşturulması, özel sektörle yakından bağlantı kurulması, doğru düzgün market analizinin yapılması, doğru gerçek hakiki market analizinin yapılması, finansal servislerin, bunlar hibeler olabilir, grantlar olabilir, mikro krediler olabilir, produktif üretime yönelik girdilerin sağlanması, beceri geliştirici eğitimlerin yapılması gibi öneriler var. Baktığımız zaman literatürde ama Türkiye gibi ya da bölge ülkeleri gibi Ürdün, Lübnan gibi orta mid income dediğimiz orta gelir seviyesindeki ülkeler için ya da gelişmekte olan ülkeler diyelim durum daha da farklı. Çünkü Türkiye'nin bazı bölgelerine baktığımız zaman, yoğunlaştığımız zaman aslında mültecilerle buradaki yerel Türkiye'lilerin yaşadığı sorunların birbiriyle çok örtüştüğünü de görüyoruz. Dolayısıyla topyekün bir bakışa ihtiyaç olduğunu söylemek mümkün. Tabii şeyin hakkını vermek lazım. Mülteciler, burada yaşayan Türkiye'lilerin yaşadığı sorunları kat ve kat yaşıyorlar. Ama sorunu sadece mülteci tarafından çözmek sanırım yeterli olmayacaktır. Topyekün çözmekte fayda olacaktır diye düşünüyoruz.
Thank you.
Teşekkür ederim. Ben ismim Sevgi Ayhan. Bizim Urfa'da bir kadın merkezimiz mevcut. Bu Türkiye'de ilk kadın merkezini biz Urfa'da açtık. Kadınlara yönelik yaptığımız eğitimlerde kadınların çocuklara çok fazla şiddet uyguladığını ve emzirmek istemediklerini tespit ettik. Sizin de bahsettiğiniz gibi şiddet, özellikle toksik şiddet, çocukların beyin gelişimi açısından çok önemli ve sonuçta bu çocukları ileride potansiyel suçluya dönüştürebilecek bir nedene sebep olabiliyor. Biz Urfa'da da toplum merkezimizde psikoloğumuz var ve çocuk kreşimiz mevcut. Burada çocuklara yönelik eğitimler, aktiviteler, onların şiddetle baş etmelerine yönelik sosyal yaptığımız içerikler mevcut. Bir Ankara'da da kadın merkezi açmayı planlıyoruz. Bahsetmek istediğim STK'ların bu konuda daha çok ön plana çıkarılması ve onların desteklenmesine yönelik bir program, bir katkı sağlayabilir mi bu programın? Onu belirtmek istedim. Teşekkür ederim.
Great. I'm not sure I can answer the question of funding for civil society except to say that I think in the area that we're talking about, it's extremely important, and how you go to scale on some of these, these issues are going to be important. Just two quick comments. One is on the economic side of things. All the research suggests that one of the key interventions dealing with adversity has to do with strengthening the economic status at the household level, especially in developing countries. Getting families over the basic food consumption level puts parents in a position to actually start parenting more positively. So economic strengthening combined with positive parenting seems to work. Civil society engagement is very important. We found too in other places, sometimes parents are overwhelmed and stressed, or they don't know what to do. And with technology and smartphones and whatever, you can actually develop apps that households can access around kind of just key advice. What are the 5 things you can do on a day-to-day basis with your kids to, increase their curiosity, their intellectual capacity, and whatnot. So there's lots of ways that we can get preventative health and public health messages into the family short of people coming to us. And I think we need to think in both directions. Yes, ma'am.
Teşekkürler. Yetersiz kalan ev ortamın çok önemli. Bir konuya dikkat çekmek istedim. Bizim daha önce Türkiye'de hiç görmediğimiz kadar çok çocuk şu anda sokaklarda çalışıyor. Hiç görmediğimiz kadar bakımsız çocuklar, dilencilik, bir patlama oldu. Yani eminim bir epidemiyolojisine baksak böyle bir patlama daha önce ülkede hiç görmediğimiz bir patlama ve muhtemelen bunun arkasında hiç anlayamayacağımız sağlıkçılar olarak hiç anlayamayacağımız bir suç örgütü yapılanması var. Önerilerimiz ne olabilir? Yani emniyetle birlikte yürütülmesi gereken belki araştırmalar var, hizmet tarafı var. Bu baş edilemeyecek kadar büyük bir soruna doğru gidiyor. Ev ortamı, yetersiz kalan aile psikolojisi, bunlar çok önemli ama sanki bundan da öte ciddi bir problemle karşı karşıyayız gibi geliyor. Yorumlarınızı bilmek isterim. Teşekkür ederim.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the right person to comment about it as a phenomenon. I'm sure there's people here that know more than I do. Most street children are connected to families. They're there working. I think there's a difference between people, kids that work on the street and go home at night, have parents, then versus kids that stay on the street 24 hours per day. So I just think you need to take that into account. I'm going to suggest it's probably an economic issue.
My concern was that there are criminal networks that need to be elaborated on.
Okay.
It might go beyond the family and the household. I just wanted to draw attention
Thank
to
you.
this. That was a
Yeah.
study.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Let's go over here, and then we'll come back to you.
I'm a clinical psychologist, so my points are probably more about mental health. But one point that you made is very interesting to me. You talked about the camp and how that kind of puts people in a kind of a dependent position. And I think some of the things that we're discussing always is at an individual level. Let's provide this for the child, or let's provide this for the mother who's depressed. And I think what I'm hearing from you is what we're missing is the whole unit. We need to do something about the whole unit, and that's what we're seeing in terms of mental health. When you do something for the child, it actually does something negative for the mother, which allows, makes her position even more unnecessary, for example.
Observations. I'll share two things. One is when we've looked at mental health clinics in other parts of the world, and especially for females, so they're coming into an office or a room, even if it's in the community, to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And I'm thinking, for example, of Southeast Asian women in a European country. If their appointment was at 11 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they would come in at the same time. They'd come in early in the morning and they'd sit in the waiting room. And what was observed is there was all this talking between the women before they went to see the psychiatrist. But when they went to see the psychiatrist, it wasn't a terribly active conversation. It was more of a compliant sort of thing. And they began to understand that one of the best forms of supports were amongst the people themselves, and they began to sort of change their practices. So again, I think that's something to just consider, is the way that refugees can help one another, and maybe in particular women and women. The other thing I'll mention is, again, if we look at what can be done at the household level, if you thought about a limited number of outcomes that you wanted to achieve. So what is it you want to see achieved at the household level? So maybe it's when babies are like stimulation, engagement, sanitation, things, be careful of toxins, whatever those things are. You want to, what are the outcomes? And then work backwards. How would those be achieved, and how would those be achieved at scale? And then how would you know whether they're being achieved or whatnot? And I think rather than thinking about people coming to our clinics, is think about what needs to be there and what are the ways of delivering that, just as a way of considering some of the functions perhaps of these migrant centers that you're beginning to think about. Okay, I think we're just basically out of time, yeah? So I want to thank you very much for your wonderful insights, and let's remember that for children, the center of their universe and health system is in the household, and that there's particular needs that they have, and if we don't start addressing those, then the kinds of chronic problems you're going to be dealing with as adults are going to be increased. Thank you.
Şimdi öğle yemeği için bir ara vereceğiz. Yalnız saat 1'de biraz 15 dakika sarktık ama saat 1'de tekrar burada olmanızı